It appeared as if the day would not be a total loss when a fisherman felt a tug on his line. However, the fisherman would not be heading to the market with a grin on his face. Instead, what the fisherman hauled up was not shrimp or prawn, but a most terrifying sight greeted him. Rising from the depths was a rusted steel crucifix with a human body fastened to it. On episode 4 of Beyond the Blood, we explore Australia's Rackman.
Gilchrist County 911, what's the address of the emergency?
Yes, ma'am. I just shot my daughter and shot all my grandkids, and I'll be sitting on my step, and then when you get here, I'm going to shoot myself.
You will find a homicide at Suite 43 South Pershing, Nancy Fox.
You admit to being evil, Richard?
We are all evil in some form or another, are we not?
All crimes have a motive. Go beyond the blood and discover the reasoning behind the darkest crimes in history.
It would be easy to associate a crucifix and a decomposing human corpse with times less civilized. However, this story is not out of medieval times, but occurred just over 2 decades ago. I suppose it is safe to state we should not underestimate the creativity or the depths of the human mind when it comes to torturing our fellow man. I was surprised when I discovered that this event had a definite lack of information available. I will share with you the results of my research. It was a Thursday morning, August 11, 1994. A fisherman named Mark Peterson was trawling the depths of Hawkesbury River just north of Sydney past Challenger Head on his boat Lady Marion when he snagged a heavy load. Mark was ecstatic when he initially caught what he assumed must have been a rather decent haul. However, what came from the depths of the river was not fish or even typical river junk, but would turn Mark's day into a bizarre mystery that would last for over 2 decades. As the fisherman's line began to rise from the river, what he saw must have terrified him. Mark had hauled in a decomposing human corpse wrapped in plastic bags. The bags were tied to rusted metal bars, which were welded into the shape of a crucifix. The fisherman would of course rush back to land and phone the police, and the members of the physical evidence section would soon be examining the remains. Once the physical evidence section confirmed that the corpse was indeed human, they sent the body and the rack to New South Wales Institute of Forensic Science, where it was examined by pathologist Dr. Christopher Lawrence. When Dr. Lawrence removed the sheets of black plastic, he found that there were clothes, hair, soft tissue, and a grayish, waxy substance formed by the decomposition of soft tissue in dead bodies subjected to moisture attached to the remains. He also noticed that the murderer or murderers had used wire and orange rope to bind the body to the metal frame. Dr. Lawrence noted that the set of bones on the steel slab before him were roughly anatomically arranged. The doctor observed the bony and soft tissue were wrapped in a long sheet of black plastic, and that 2 plastic bags had been used to cover the person's head. An in-depth examination of the corpse, including the hair, revealed that the corpse was that of a Caucasian male, possibly from the Mediterranean or Central European descent. Furthermore, Dr. Lawrence found that the rack man was between 21 and 46 years of age, a rather large gap in the possible age, but I'm certain that the age was not easy to discover, given the body had been affected by the time it spent in the water. It was also determined that rack man was more than likely 5'2" and 5'4" in height. Lawrence said that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, but it was not clear if the rack man had been tied to the metal frame before or after the gruesome murder. After wrapping him in plastic, the creator of this monstrosity, or like-minded associates, had bound him with rope. If the besieged victim was still alive, any concept of escaping was ruined when his jailer wrapped wire around his neck and torso. Quote, I would say as an investigator that it's an unusual way to dispose of a person, end quote, says Detective Chief Inspector John Lehman from the New South Wales Unsolved Homicide Team. And was this person attached to the frame and tortured before he was thrown in, he speculates? There's a possibility that disturbs the veteran detective. When forensic odontologist Dr. Chris Griffiths at the University of Sydney scrutinized the skull and teeth, he found that John Doe's face may have been lacking in a natural or normal shape. Additionally, his first lower right molar had been removed when he was younger. When Professor Donald Anderson of the School of Biological Sciences, also at the University of Sydney, studied the development of the barnacles on the steel crucifix, Anderson said the rack was likely underwater for less than a year, but would not rule out that it could have been longer. Because decay and water erosion caused the rackman's fingerprints to deteriorate and DNA samples to be of poor quality, checking fingerprints and DNA databases for possible matches would prove to be a futile effort. So detectives looked into the clothes the rackman was wearing. An Everything Australia polo shirt in a size medium and No Sweat brand sweatpants. But this was also unproductive because these items were sold throughout all of Australia. There was a pack of Benson and Hedges cigarettes and a pink lighter in his left pocket. He also wore a pair of Sparrow brand blue and white striped underpants, which were designed to fit an 85 centimeter waist. The original investigators tracked down the shirt's manufacturer, who gave them a general idea where the garment might have been purchased. Police showed the shirt to the operations manager from Everything Australian, who indicated that the company used the logo on the shirt tag between 1982 and 1987. John says she also indicated that during that period of time, the company had around 23 stores throughout Australia, mainly in New South Wales and Queensland. Forensics would then reconstruct Rackman's face from the skull. Then Detective Senior Constable Phil Redmond from the Physical Evidence section generated some computer-enhanced pictures and added a few diverse hairstyles to the artwork to help with the identification. The pictures were published in newspapers and broadcast on Australia's Most Wanted, a highly popular television program. Some of the most promising tips were those that suggested the Rackman might have been Joe Biviano or Peter Mitras. In 1993, a convicted drug dealer named Joe Biviano went missing from a suburb near Sydney. Biviano's description seemed to fit Rackman's profile. He was born in 1963. Biviano was 30 years old at the time of his disappearance. He was about 5'4" and had dark hair. Also, Biviano's facial features were comparable to the characteristics seen in the reconstruction of Rackman, but there was no way to make a positive identification because Biviano had no dental records on file, and the DNA sample from one of Biviano's relatives did not match the sample taken from the Rackman's remains. Peter Mitras, a Greek businessman who vanished from King's Cross in 1991, reportedly died in an eerily similar fashion to Rackman. Police received information that Mitras had been banished to death and his body dumped in the ocean off Sydney. However, Mitras was much taller than Rackman, at around 5'10", and Mitras' sister said that his teeth looked nothing like John Doe's. Then there was the possibility that the victim was Stephen Bryant, who stated to his friends, James and Christian, that he'd spend Christmas with them near Grafton in northern New South Wales, but he never turned up. Subsequent inquiries led police to suspect that Stephen may have been involved in a drug ripoff which led to his demise. The final possibility was that the remains were those of heavy gambler Matt Tanskavitsky, whose live-in lover last saw him in January of 1993 at Newtown in Sydney's inner west. At the time of his disappearance, Matt had $1,800 in cash on him, but it wasn't unusual for him to withdraw large sums of money from the bank. It wasn't unusual for him to travel to the Gold Coast on a gambling binge either, but he always came home a few days later, just not this time. So if none of these men are Rackman, that presents another mystery. What happened to the remains of these 4 men? Unfortunately, the tips that the Sydney Law Enforcement Agency received from publishing the facial recognition led nowhere. Over 20 years later, the case of the Rackman is now in the hands of Detective Chief Inspector John Lehman from the New South Wales Unsolved Homicide Team. Lehman hopes that the distinctive steel rack will help heat up this cold case. The steel crucifix was built using a section of flat metal that was about 1.82 meters long with 2 bars fused to it. The bars were reinforced with rods that were bent into an L shape over the corpse. Investigators believe that the person who fabricated the rack had access to these materials and the experience to build the crucifix. This would mean that he or she might either be a welder or a metal worker. Identifying Rackman has been the #1 problem ever since the rusty steel frame and its grisly human cargo were dragged from the depths of the water. Quote, until you identify the victim, you haven't got a starting point, end quote, Detective John Lehman explains. At least with a victim who has been identified, you can look at who the person was and ask questions like, what was he doing? Who were his associates? Was he in trouble? Was he known to the police? And if so, for what reasons? Victimology, the study of a victim and their associations, is crucial to the success of a homicide investigation. The background of a person will tell you so much. In this case, for example, was he a drug dealer? Did he owe people money? Knowing those things would open so many doors. With advances in technology, Detective John Lehman is certain one day DNA will eventually name the Rackman. The DNA database is always checking samples, Detective Lehman says, explaining that it's the job of the New South Wales Missing Persons Unit to collect DNA samples from the relatives of missing people to match against unidentified remains. But that hasn't been successful with Rackman to date. The gangland-style disposal of the body strongly suggests the victim was involved in something unlawful, which led to his nightmarish end. But what? You do think of organized crime, or something the victim may have been involved in, John says. Quote, a normal person would not expect to meet their demise like this. So we think the victim was involved in some kind of criminal activity, end quote. Today, the body of Rackman still lies refrigerated at the morgue, waiting for someone to claim him and give him a proper burial. Even if he was an underworld player, he certainly didn't deserve to die like this. Police are offering a $100,000 reward for information leading to the identification of Rackman and the arrest and conviction of those responsible for his murder. Some questions I have to wonder involved in this case. I'm sure everyone else must wonder. I cannot imagine this being a one-man job. Given the weight of the crucifix alone, let alone having to transport the crucifix, this points to me that this job involved more than one individual. This would lead me to conclude that this was an organized task. So logically, Rackman must have been involved in the seedier side of society. Also, given the weight of the crucifix, was Rackman murdered near the water? That does not necessarily mean Rackman lived near the water, but at the time the crime itself was perpetrated near the water. Also, given the weight of the crucifix, was Rackman murdered near the water? That does not necessarily mean Rackman lived near the water, but that the crime itself was perpetrated near the water. One must think logically that no one involved in murder or organized crime would want to transport a crucifix that must weigh several hundred pounds across town, let alone with the remains of a human body. Have authorities located the boat used to dispose of the crucifix? I would be startled if years later the boat held any forensics, but nonetheless, one could use a hull number to trace the owner of the boat and perhaps those who used the boat to transport the human remains of Rackman. Perhaps the man was not an Australian citizen. It would make sense to me that Rackman had not had contact with his relatives in his native homeland before his murder, or perhaps his family had no idea Rackman traveled to Australia. This would explain why no one has reached out to Australian authorities with a definite clue. With little to no mention in the United States about this case, I would not be surprised if those in Rackman's homeland have not even heard of this case. I am curious how much attention this case has received in Australia itself. My conclusion, at a glance, is that Rackman was not from Australia originally, and perhaps had arrived in Australia shortly before his demise. Second, that Rackman was involved in some sort of shady transaction, whether it was gambling, prostitution, or drugs. It must have been a transaction that would have invited unsavory individuals into his life. Ultimately, DNA, I feel, will be the key to this mystery. It will take time for DNA technology to catch up to the point where the degraded DNA can be used. I do not feel Rackman is actually any of the individuals that have been theorized. In over 20 years, authorities truly only had 4 real candidates for Rackman. That is rather astonishing low, which goes back to my theory that Rackman was not Australian and did not spend a significant amount of time in Australia before his death. I wish there was more to this case. As I said in the introduction, I have exhausted all my resources for clues into this story. It has been a case that has pushed my research ability to the extreme. Many cases are full of details, but this case has certainly been lacking on what is released to the public, even over 20 years later. What are your thoughts on the case of Australia's Rackman? Leave us a message on Twitter at BeyondBloodPC. Find us at BeyondBloodPodcast.com. Don't forget, Beyond the Blood is on iTunes, Stitcher, and Podbean. Please review Beyond the Blood on the platform of your choice. Beyond the Blood will be at CrimeCon 2017. Join me in Indianapolis, June 9th through the 11th. On episode 5, we explore an unsolved case out of California. This criminal used the night to stalk his victims. I'm not speaking of Richard Ramirez.